subconscious of our nation. Looking at history from below, there lie nightmares, experiences of thousands of men and women as nightmares, gory scenes of daughters and wives being raped, fiendish male faces digging knives into the hearts of their own friends, mothers killing their babes to save them from something worse than death, masses fleeing with mortal fright. That was partition. Partition that drowned the cheer of the joy of freedom of the country. Ordinarily as a nation, we have remained in amnesia, not to confront the reality of the experience of partition. For a healthy existence, we need to understand what happened, why it happened the way it did, and how it happened. If we want to understand the phenomenon that was partition, we will have to go to literature. Literature that gives us experientially, both at the subjective level and at the objective level, the entire history of a time. We have to go to writers like Bhisham Sahni, who is eminently known, very well known in Hindi and outside the Hindi world for all that he has written on partition. And for that, we are very fortunate to have this opportunity to be talking to him. Let us see his life in relation to the history of the times. Bhishamji, I was wondering, most of your writing seems to have as its kind of a nodal point partition, around which your writings revolve, your ideas, your psyche seems to be going back to it again and again. And it's partition not just in relation to the geographical aspect of partition, but also the psychological, the religious, at various levels. Am I right when I say that your life seems to be revolving around this experience of partition?
I won't say that it revolves around the issue of partition. It was a big event, it was a very disturbing event, and yet one does not live in the past. One essentially grapples with one's destiny as it emerges in the future. It is such is human nature.
While literature transcends time, its roots are in the soil in which it is born. No writer, says Bhisham Sahni, can skip his time. This is so true of Bhishamji himself. He was born in Rawalpindi in 1915, and his life and writings are soaked in the sociology and history of 20th century India. We can focus a little bit on this whole idea of what partition may have consciously, how it may have consciously affected you in the sense of a rupture and a renewal.
मेरी जिंदगी में इस घटना ने बहुत ज़्यादा मेरे जहन को प्रभावित किया। कुछ इसलिए कि मेरी आंखों के सामने बहुत कुछ घटा, कुछ इसलिए कि जिस माहौल में मैं इससे पहले रह रहा था वो धीरे धीरे कैसे उसमें तनाव बढ़ रहे थे, इसका भी मुझे अनुभव हुआ। कुछ ये भी था कि बचपन के दिनों में जब मैं छोटा था तो हमारे शहर में पहला हिंदू मुस्लिम दंगा हुआ था। तब मैं 11-12 बरस का था और अनाज मंडी को आग लगी थी और आग के शोले इतने दूर दूर तक फैले थे कि आधा आसमान लाल हो गया था। और गर्मी के दिन थे, हम लोग छत पर सोते थे और मेरे पिताजी तो हम से कहें कि लेट जाओ, सो जाओ, कुछ नहीं है, लेकिन जब हम लेटते तो सारा आकाश लाल नज़र आता। तो उसकी छाप जो थी वो मेरे मन पर पड़ना लाजमी थी। यूँ बचपन के दिन तो तनाव के दिन नहीं होते, आदमी महसूस ही नहीं करता कि कोई इस तरह की समस्या है, ये क्या है। और जिस शहर में मैं रहता था वो मिला जुला शहर था। मेरे बहुत से दोस्त मुसलमान दोस्त थे, रावलपिंडी, और मुझे हॉकी खेलने का शौक़ था जिसमें टीम के अधिकांश लोग मुसलमान लड़के थे। मेरे अपने दोस्त यार थे जो अंत तक रहा। You see, my father was a devout Arya Samajist, and we were brought up very much on the lines of, the Arya Samaj ethical principles, which was simple kind of life and God-fearing, Havan and Sandhya and so on and so forth. But the place where we lived, our house, had Muslims on all sides, Muslim families. We were predominantly Muslim mohalla. Naturally, we went and played in the streets, and we played in the streets with Muslim boys. And occasionally, my mother would peep over the wall, and the neighbor's lady, the neighbor's woman also would peep over the wall, and they would chat for a long time together. And I was very, very small, and I used to hear during the Ramzan days the fakir coming in the morning and waking up people, telling them to observe the roza, And so I used to beat a tin, and Utho Musalmano roza rakho. And our neighbor's lady used to complain to my mother laughingly. She says, all the year round your son keeps telling us to observe the roza. When I look back, I am not too conscious of the fact that the communal identity of people was very much on my mind. Mm-hmm. It was there, no doubt, but in a very vague sort of way. Mm-hmm. Then I went to Lahore to study, and there also the atmosphere was very different.
This is government college.
It was government college. And there also I used to play hockey, and there it was predominantly the Muslim boys who were excellent players. Some of them were Olympic players.
In 1947, Bhishamji came to Delhi to witness the Independence Day. Little did he realize that he had lost his home forever to the other side of the border. The riots had spurted. He could not go back. One by one, memories of partition stored in the sensitive mind surfaced and compelled Bhisham Sahni to produce a novel like Tamas and stories such as Amritsar Agya. He stepped thus into an impressive gallery of Hindi, Urdu and Punjabi writers, Manto, Krishan Chandra, Amrita Pritam, Mohan Rakesh, Rajendra Singh Bedi and many others, all of them anguished by divisions, pained by the insane violence of the partition riots.
When I grew up, the kinds of books that I read, Premchand's writings, for example, Sudarshan's writings, and similar writings, they did have considerable influence on my thinking. It may be that it was my own sensibility which was drawn towards Premchand. That also is possible. But this also cannot be denied, that the literary environment in which you live and breathe to a considerable extent molds your way of looking at things. And so later on, whether it was the freedom struggle, whether it was the assertion of different ideologies, all these, the atmosphere was charged with them. And the history of India at that time was such, the situation through which the country was passing, that you could not mentally keep aloof from it.
An active member of IPTA, Bhishamji thoroughly enjoyed acting. In fact, he has been playing roles in TV serials. The only fear in his early life? not to imitate his brother Balraj Sahni, whom he loved dearly. Balraj Sahni of the powerful Partition film Garam Hawa and the Balraj Sahni of Kabuliwala.
Then my brother also played a very big role. Of course, he was not much older, only 2 years difference, but he had a very independent mind and a very innovative mind. He would invent different kinds of games, and he had a very sensitive appreciation of literature. So, and I began to hero worship him also at a very young age. He was also a very strong influence.
आपने कहीं कहा है कि आप बहुत कॉन्शियस हुए थे कि ये बहुत ज़्यादा असर हो रहा है.
That is true. That is true. That came later because I was convinced that it was necessary to go my own way. You know, that sort of feeling began to grow strong in me.
Bhishamji's novel Tamas moves like a camera over the entire scenario. No wonder the director Govind Nihalani picked it up to serialize it for the television. The writer looks back at Partition 25 years after it happened, with life incidents, characters, dialogues creeping into the narrative so naturally, so simply. In the novel again, Tamas, I find that, the opening is so powerful. Like that, there's very intense moments that come up. In this case, the beginning is intense with the idea of Nathu trying to kill the pig. Now, it's almost, the intensity is poetic. It's very, very poetic. And something is going to come up after this. It's kind of foreboding. I would just like to, ask you this very pointed question which does come up again and again in the novel, and maybe you've done some conscious thinking about it. To what extent do you think the British were responsible for this whole phenomenon of writing at that time?
You see, I wish I could cite to you a particular letter written by one of the viceroys, in which he states that the day Hindus and Muslims come together, the day of our departure from the shores of India will have arrived. You see, it is a clear enough indication that the empire flourished so long as the Hindus and the Muslims were flying at one another's throat. So, the leaders of the movement, Gandhi included, all along put forth this view that a policy of divide and rule was being followed by the British, and it was a consciously evolved policy, and it did not cover only the political aspect of life, it also covered the cultural aspect of life. Now they would be patting the Hindus on the back, at another time the Muslims on the back, and this went on for quite some time.
I would like to go back to Tamas now and pick up one incident which is, to which I think you go back again and again, which is that well incident.
Oh.
Women jumping into the well when they are threatened. Is there any real life situation that you have in mind when you...
Of course. You see, it so happened that when the riots subsided, there had been riot in the town of Rawalpindi, and there had been trouble in the villages also. You see, and more than 100 villages were involved. And this particular incident had taken place in one of the villages. So it so happened, I was working in the Congress in a relief committee And the health officer of the town had been asked by the deputy commissioner to go to that particular village and put disinfectant on that well where the dead bodies were decomposing, you see. And the health officer happened to be a neighbor of ours. And when I learnt about it, I requested him to take me along too. And he was good enough to agree. And I went. And what I saw was there. Of course, the bloated bodies had come to the surface. And it was a painful experience. It's very difficult to get over it even today. Because I hear voices, like that. One of the persons standing next to me was pointing out to me and he said, "That is my wife. Don't you see that child entangled between her legs? That is my son."
तमस की ही बात करते हुए उसमें जो आपने जर्नैल सिंह का पोर्ट्रेल किया है, बार बार ख्याल आता है कई और कैरेक्टर्स का भी जो ख़ास तौर पे जो मंटो का टोबा टेक सिंह है. Bhisham ji, I was wondering if you were in any way inspired also by Toba Tek Singh in the delineation of Jarnail in Tamas. In any way?
I don't know. It's very difficult to say. Not consciously.
Okay.
Of course, Toba Tek Singh is one of the very great stories written on this particular theme. Besides, Manto has written a few others also, which were very moving and very poignant stories. It's very difficult to say. But since this character was based on a character from life, with whom I had worked in the Congress, and with whom I had quarreled also a number of times, he was very vivid in my mind. When a film was made of this, this novel, I received a letter from Patna. Somebody who was living, originally belonged to my hometown, but after the partition had settled down there. He wrote to me, "What business had you to kill that man? The man is living and he is in Ambala." So it was rather amused, but nevertheless, whether a person is living today or not living, he assumes a significance for the writer. It's a strange thing. Many people were in the struggle for freedom, but the lower middle class persons had a role peculiar of their own. They had no personal ambitions. They had no ambitions of becoming leaders, even during the struggle period, or of becoming anybody after the freedom was won. And they came from backgrounds which were poor. I think of a carpenter, Sardarji. He was not very healthy, and his main job used to be, whenever a jalsa was organized of the Congress in early days, before the freedom was, his job was to take a harmonium and sing songs and to attract an audience. He was neither a singer, nobody. Only he could speak witty things and make people laugh. The man had been to jail several times. The man was ill. The man was poor. And yet there was a certain commitment in him. Such characters were very interesting for me. Such characters were very impressive in their own way, for their sheer selflessness.
Bhagya Rekha, Nishachar, Pehla Paat, Wangchu, and other volumes of short stories. His novels Basanti, Maya Das Ki Mari, and plays Kadiyan, Hanush, Kabira Khada Bazaar Mein, came year after year, offering characters and narratives from life experience with the starkly realistic perception, delicately and sensitively woven into stories. Combating the abstract modern story, Bhisham Sahni's stories grounded themselves in social realism. Not surprising, therefore, his rich bonding with the Progressive Writers Association and the Afro-Asian Writers Organization.
While working in the literary sphere, I made many friends. In the Nai Kahani movement, there were Mohan Rakesh and Kamaleshwar and Rajendra Yadav and so on and so forth. And in the Progressive Writers movement, there was Sajjad Zahir and people I have mentioned. So I felt enriched by what they had written. It is wrong to think that progressive writing was a one-dimensional kind of movement. Anyway, it's not my purpose to discuss it here, but some of the things were very very positive and very healthy. For instance, they brought writers from all languages together on a basis of equality and mutual respect. The social orientation in art had already started taking place earlier, in Premchand's time, even earlier. Only they gave it another dimension. That is true.
Talking about Bhishamji's languages, Punjabi gently rolls down his tongue as his mother tongue. Urdu, Hindi, English, in which he has an MA and a PhD, flow out of his lips with an equal ease. He also edited Nai Kahaniyan, an important Hindi magazine, for nearly 2.5 years, leaving his mark as an editor on the journal. While Bhishamji has been translating from Russian, he chose to write in Hindi, in a language that reflects the common cultural heritage amongst Hindi, Urdu and Punjabi.
My mother tongue is Punjabi. I write in Hindi. I have been educated in Urdu, and I find all these three languages having a lot in common. I may write in Hindi, but if a person speaks to me in Urdu, I understand him. If he speaks to me in Punjabi, I understand him. But I believe we have been very short-sighted about our own culture, about the contribution of Urdu to our culture, and this language has enriched India's treasure house of literature as very few other languages have done. And therefore it is 1,000 pities that sufficient attention has not been paid, or on the contrary, a very negative attitude has been adopted towards the Urdu language, which was somehow linked with partition. It was communalized. Urdu is not the language of one community. Urdu is the language of our entire country, north of India. And it has had its birth in India, it has had its flowering in India, and it has left behind a rich legacy for our entire country.
The quiet wisdom of a sage on the one hand, and on the other, the innocence of a child. Bhishamji's personality reaches out to everyone. He has received the Sahitya Academy Award along with many other literary laurels. He remains the humble and gentle torchbearer, someone for the younger writers to emulate. Presenting the scroll of real life, his fiction purges the society of a history that can pervert, of haunting memories that can stifle and kill from within.
I would like to know, do you think you have anything more which needs to come out on partition within you, and you feel that you need to at some point of time, still work at it and write on partition, or do you think you've done with it?
No, I don't think it's been done with, but it depends. Much of the writing it is the subconscious that becomes active. Suddenly something upsets you, or I've written a number of stories decades after the partition, relating to the partition. So I can't rule out the possibility, but at present I have nothing on my mind.
Thank you very much, Bhishamji, for having given us this opportunity to actually get to know your life as much as your writings. And I'm sure we'll go back to your literature that you have produced with a greater understanding of not just you as a person, and not just as that aspect of history which happened at a particular time, but the way it has left its kind of scar in each one of us and the way it has affected our lives. Thank you very much.